Good evening, and welcome back to another night through history. Tonight, we are going far back in time to the Ice Age, to a colder Earth filled with enormous mammals, wide grasslands, and deep blue glaciers. We will wander through frozen valleys, follow herds of mammoths, and listen to the wind that once blew across an almost empty world. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. If you enjoy spending these quiet nights together, please consider liking and subscribing. It is the easiest way to support this channel, and it truly helps a lot. Thank you for being here. When you are ready, you can close your eyes if you like. Take a slow breath, relax your shoulders, and let your mind drift back into the Ice Age. Now, let us begin. Imagine holding a globe in your hands and giving it a very slow spin. The blue seas look familiar, the outlines of the continents more or less the same, but the story we are about to tell begins long before the first glacier rolled across North America or Europe. To understand the Ice Age, you have to start in a world that would have felt almost tropical to us. A world where crocodiles basked in Arctic rivers and palm trees, grew far to the north of their modern comfort zone. Earth has not always been a cold planet. For most of its history, it has been rather fond of being warm and damp, with forests in places where we now find snowfields and desert. The Ice Age was an exception, a long, cool experiment in climate that began only after a great deal of quiet rearranging of land, sea, and air. For a moment, walk back in time to an Earth just after the dinosaurs have gone. The age of reptiles has ended with a spectacularly bad day involving an asteroid, firestorms, and many millions of unfortunate creatures. In the quiet that follows, mammals pick themselves up, dust off the ash, and begin to spread. At first, they are small, quick little things that curl in burrows, climb in trees, or skulk in the shadows. But with the great reptiles gone, the world opens like an empty house after a long party. Mammals grow larger, more varied, more adventurous. They take over the night, then the day, then the forests and the plains. For tens of millions of years, the planet is warm enough that these rising mammals live in a greenhouse world. The poles are free of permanent ice. Oceans carry heat farther toward the poles than they do today. Storm tracks are different, coastlines are different, and the idea of a vast frozen cap of ice would have seemed completely absurd. The first hints that Earth is about to change come from deep inside the planet and along its restless edges. Continents are not fixed decorations. They drift, they collide, they tear apart and rejoin in slow motion. One of the most important of these slow collisions happens when a strip of land rises between the continents that we now call North America and South America. With time, this strip closes the gap, creating what we now know as Central America. The moment the seas on either side are no longer freely connected, the oceans have to rearrange themselves. Warm water that once wandered easily between the two great basins is forced to take new routes. Currents strengthen in some places, weaken in others. The atmosphere, which listens closely to whatever the oceans are doing, begins to adjust. Clouds move to new tracks. Rain falls in different patterns. What begins as a geological event ends up as a climate story. At the same time, far away across the planet, another set of collisions has been raising mountains. India has rammed into Asia, crumpling up the land and lifting the Great Wall of the Himalaya and the Tibetan Plateau. These high fields of rock act like a huge roof placed on the world. They change the way air moves. Monsoon winds are guided and amplified. High, cold surfaces encourage more reflection of sunlight back into space. Rivers carry enormous amounts of ground-up rock into the oceans, where that powder helps draw carbon from the air as it reacts and settles. Over very long periods, these processes quietly lower the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Less carbon means less trapping of the sun's heat. Earth, which had been luxuriating in a warm cloak of greenhouse gases, begins to thin that cloak stitch by stitch. Seen from space, none of this looks dramatic. There is no sudden snap. The planet does not simply decide one morning that it requires ice. Climate is more like a very large, very nervous machine. It hums along for ages in one state. Then a few small changes push it closer to the edge of a new mode of behavior. A tiny change in sunlight here, a bit less carbon there, a shift in the way clouds gather along the equator, and eventually the machine becomes ready to do something it has not done for a long time. It becomes ready to grow ice sheets that can sit on continents without quickly melting away. When that moment arrives, the poles and the high mountains respond first. Snow that falls in these places can survive the summer. One thin layer becomes 2, then 3, then hundreds. Under its own weight, the snow compacts to ice. What began as winter weather slowly becomes geography. At this point, another subtle actor steps in, one that lives far above all this ice and rock. The path that Earth takes around the Sun is not perfectly constant. It wobbles, the orbit stretches and relaxes. The planet tilts a little more or a little less. Over cycles that last tens of thousands of years, these small astronomical quirks change how much sunlight different parts of the planet receive in different seasons. A slightly greater tilt can make winters colder and summers warmer in one hemisphere. A slightly more stretched orbit can make the planet spend more time at a greater distance from the Sunday. Each change on its own is modest. But once the climate machine is primed for cold, these celestial nudges act like a hand on a thermostat. When summers in the far north become just a little too weak to melt all the snow left from the previous winter, snow begins to linger year after year. The pale surfaces reflect more sunlight back into space. That reflection removes even more heat from the system. The air over those growing white fields cools, which allows more snow to fall as storms track along the cold boundary between frozen land and open sea. Glaciers thicken. They begin to creep downhill, slowly at first, then with a kind of glacial determination that cares nothing for forests or rivers that lie in the way. It is at this point that the Ice Age, as we usually imagine it, really begins to take shape. Down on the ground, the world feels surprisingly patchy. Not every place grows bitterly cold or piles up ice. The equatorial regions remain warm, with forests and savannas where life continues to hum along. Tropical seas stay liquid and full of coral reefs, but the large continents in the northern half of the planet start to grow bright caps of ice. Mountain ranges in many parts of the world acquire permanent glaciers on their summits. High plateaus, once the preserve of shrubs and hardy animals, begin to look like white deserts of compressed snow. Sea levels, which had been higher in the warm ages, start to sink as more water is locked away on land in frozen form. It is as if Earth is quietly moving water from one account to another, draining the oceans to fund the growth of icy towers. For the animals that live through these early turns of the climatic wheel, the change is both a challenge and an opportunity. Mammals, whose warm bodies allow them to keep moving even in cold air, are particularly suited to this new, restless planet. Some stay in the warmer zones and continue the familiar business of browsing, hunting, and raising young in forests and grasslands. Others edge closer toward the cooling fringes of the world. Those that can grow thicker fur put on more fat in autumn and travel long distances in search of seasonal food have an advantage as climates swing cool and then milder again. Over many generations, bodies lengthen or shorten. Limbs become stronger for trudging across snowfields or tearing into frozen ground, and senses sharpen to find food in a landscape that alternates between a feast of summer growth and a long, hungry winter. At this stage, Earth has not yet settled into the kind of deep freeze that will later produce vast blankets of ice over Canada, Scandinavia, and Siberia. The early phases of the Ice Age involve a kind of experimental cycling. Glaciers grow thicker in one epoch, then retreat again when the orbital conditions soften the winters. Forests expand northward, then are pushed back by advancing cold. Grasslands shift like living carpets, following the bands of temperature and rainfall. River systems adjust their courses as glaciers block valleys or drop loads of sediment into old channels. Lakes appear where ice dams water, then vanish as the ice melts and drains them like pulled plugs in a bathtub. The map of the world is constantly rewritten in these slow, icy calligraphies. If you could live through one of these cycles, you might hardly notice the change during your lifetime. A single human life fits comfortably within only a brief wiggle of the climate record. But when you watch the process on the scale of thousands of years, the change is dramatic. Imagine a valley where your grandparents hunted in dense woodland. In your grandchildren's time, that valley might be filled with a grey tongue of ice that creaks and groans as it flows. Hills that once carried soil and trees become scraped down to bare rock. Boulders picked up by the moving ice are carried many kilometers and dropped in unfamiliar places. From a mountain top you could watch as the white surface slowly eats its way down slope, swallowing soils, rivers, and even entire forests. While all of this is happening in the high latitudes and mountains, the atmosphere as a whole is moving toward a new average condition. Winds strengthen over the cold surfaces. Storm tracks adjust, sometimes bringing heavy snowfall to places that rarely saw it before. In some regions, winters become longer and summers shorter. In others, moisture becomes scarce because so much water is stored on land as ice. Deserts can become colder as well as drier, a combination that encourages hardy shrubs instead of forests. The oceans respond with their own complex choreography. Colder polar waters sink more readily, pulling surface currents along new paths. The pattern of heat exchange between equator and poles changes, which in turn shapes where clouds form and how they march across continents. From the viewpoint of life, including the rising mammals. The New Age is a story of migration and adaptation, rather than a simple story of doom. When ice advances, animals and plants retreat in front of it or learn to live in its shadow. When the climate warms and the ice withdraws, they follow the open ground back toward higher latitudes. Whole communities of species essentially travel back and forth over the face of continents in time with the climate cycles. Seeds ride in the fur of wandering herbivores. Predators pad silently behind herds, learning new routes and new hunting grounds as rivers and lakes change their courses. Birds develop migrations that can span thousands of kilometers, connecting summer breeding grounds in the cool north with winter refuges in the south. Through all this, our own distant ancestors are watching in their own way. The earliest members of the human family tree appear in Africa during this long, cooling trend. They live in landscapes where grasslands and woodlands are continually rearranged by shifting rainfall patterns. Flexibility becomes a valuable trait. Hands that can shape tools, minds that can remember the locations of water in years of drought, or follow the trails of migrating animals, and social groups that can share information all become important. The background music of the Ice Age is therefore not just the creaking of glaciers and the rustling of steppe grasses, but the quiet development of intelligence in a world that rarely sits still. By the time the Ice Age truly settles in and the familiar pattern of large ice sheets advancing and retreating over northern continents has begun, the stage is fully set. Continents have drifted into positions that favor the growth of ice in one hemisphere in particular. Mountain ranges stand tall enough to host permanent snowfields. Carbon in the atmosphere has fallen to a level that allows cold periods to bite deeply. The orbit and tilt of the planet continue their patient cycles, occasionally aligning to produce summers that are just weak enough and winters that are just strong enough to let snow survive year after year on high ground. The climate machine has moved into a new mode. It will stay there for a very long time, running through its icy rhythms. And so we arrive at the threshold of the world people usually picture when they hear the phrase Ice Age, a world with vast white sheets of ice holding down the tops of continents and continents, where mammals with thick fur and enormous bodies graze in the chill winds that sweep across open plains. The first experiments in cold have already passed. The planet is now ready for a much bolder performance in ice, rock, and living fur. By the time the Great Ice Age reached its full stride, the face of Earth would have looked strange to our eyes. Not alien, exactly, but oddly rearranged, as if someone had taken the familiar globe and pulled down white curtains over the top of the northern continents, then quietly lowered the seas. If you could have hovered above the planet at the time we call the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, that is roughly what you would have seen. Europe, large parts of Asia, and almost all of what is now Canada and the northern United States sat under a gleaming shield of ice. The seas were narrower and shallower. Coastlines stretched far out from their modern lines, revealing wide new lands that existed only for that cold interval and are now lost under water. Over North America, the White Curtain was particularly impressive. A vast cap of ice, known as the Laurentide Sheet, smothered the eastern and central parts of the continent. It rose higher than any city skyline, in places more than a kilometer thick, a slow-moving mountain of frozen fresh water. To the west, another sheet sat over the coastal mountains and ranges, a neighbour that we call the Cordilleran. Between and around them lay a borderland of bare rock, frozen soil, and braided rivers of meltwater. Where the ice met the open world, the edge was seldom clean. This was a ragged frontier made of cliffs of blue ice, scalloped ridges, and dirty snow, all constantly being cut by streams that carried away the summer melt. Standing anywhere near that boundary, you would have noticed the wind first. Cold, heavy air formed over the ice and flowed outward under gravity, a slow but persistent spill of chilled atmosphere. These katabatic winds swept dust and snow off the upper surface and scoured the ground wherever they passed. In winter, they would have felt like a living thing, an invisible presence that flattened grasses and burned exposed skin. Even far from the formal edge of the ice, the climate was under its influence. Summers were cool, winters long and sharp, and the year was tilted heavily toward the season of sleep. Move east across the Atlantic in your imagination, and you encounter another frozen colossus draped over northern Europe. This sheet lay over Scandinavia, extended across what is now the Baltic region, and reached down into the northern plains of Germany and Poland. Britain was not an island then in the way we know it today. The shallow shelf that now sits under the North Sea was dry land for long stretches of the Ice Age, sometimes passing through phases of cold steppe, sometimes carrying tundra. The Scandinavian ice pressed outward, dropping its loads of stones and rock dust in thick moraines that still mark the landscape. Where it met the North Sea plain, the boundary laid out a kind of temporary coastline of ice, as dramatic in its day as any sea cliff. Beyond these northern caps was a fringe that scientists like to call periglacial, meaning simply the lands that sit beside the ice. Here the world was not entirely buried, but it was still shaped by the presence of the frozen giants. The ground froze to astonishing depths, and stayed that way year after year, a frozen subsoil that we call permafrost. In summer, only a shallow, active layer above it thawed, turning many open flats into soggy tundra. In winter, the water locked solid, and the surface cracked and shifted so that polygons of ice and soil developed like patterns on old pottery. Rivers braided through this land, constantly rearranging their channels as they tried to escape the grip of frozen banks. The vegetation of these regions would have looked surprisingly sparse, but, in its own way, rich. Trees were pushed south by the cold. The deep temperate forests we now associate with Europe and the eastern United States were squeezed into smaller, more southerly refuges. Many once proud woodlands survived only as scattered pockets in sheltered valleys or along milder coasts. In their place spread a kind of super grassland, sometimes called the Mammoth Steppe. It was a mixture of grasses, sedges, and tough herbs, dotted with shrubby willows and dwarf birch. To a visitor, it might have looked bleak. To the large grazing mammals that roamed it, this was a banquet that stretched from the Atlantic almost to the Pacific. Further east still, across what is now Russia and Siberia, the white of another ice cap broke up into a patchwork of glaciers, cold plateaus, and endless open country. Interestingly, much of Siberia itself was not covered in solid ice. The climate there was viciously cold, but also remarkably dry, which meant that snowfall was limited. Instead of a continuous glacier, there was a landscape of frozen ground under relatively thin snow, with only local mountain glaciers in high ranges. This dry cold encouraged that same steppe tundra to flourish across vast distances. It also created an enormous bridge of land at the top of the world. With so much of the planet's water locked onto land as ice, sea level had dropped by something like 120 meters compared with the present. Shallow continental shelves lay exposed to the air. Between northeastern Asia and northwestern North America, the floor of the Bering Sea rose into view as a broad, mostly flat plain. This was Beringia, a land of grasses, low hills, and shallow lakes that connected the continents. For thousands of years it linked the old world and the new, and it was alive with hoof prints. Herds of grazing animals could wander from one side of the world to the other without ever seeing the sea. Humans later did the same, but at this moment we are just looking at the geography. It is enough to say that this bridge existed and that it carried life across. The lowered seas had other consequences as well. In Southeast Asia, large islands such as Borneo, Java, and Sumatra were not truly islands. They were promontories of a vast extension of the Asian mainland, known as the Sunda Shelf. Instead of narrow straits and deep channels, there were river plains and broad lowlands. Further south, Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were joined into a single landmass we call Sahul. The modern chain of shallow seas and coral reefs that now separates these lands was then mostly a wide, dry shelf with rivers and lagoons. The world map was recognizably ours, but with its shallow seams removed, so that what we think of as islands in the south and east were often simply regions of larger supercontinents of that time. In the southern hemisphere, the Ice Age had its own, quieter drama. Antarctica, already a frozen continent before all this began, grew a thicker and more extensive cap. Its edge reached farther out over the surrounding seas, and in winter, the ocean around it froze over a greater distance, forming a seasonal ring of sea ice that covered millions of square kilometers. Along the Andes in South America, long tongues of glacier ice stretched down many valleys, and in Patagonia, at the southern tip of that continent, there was a local ice sheet that mirrored the northern ones in miniature. New Zealand carried its own mountain glaciers. Even parts of East Africa saw small accumulations of permanent ice on the summits of high volcanoes. While the ice grew on land, the atmosphere reconfigured itself in response. High over the southern oceans, the band of westerly winds that circle Antarctica strengthened. These winds drive waves and currents, and also move large amounts of airborne dust. During the peak of the Ice Age, more dust than usual was picked up from dry, cold continents and blown out over the oceans. Some of that dust settled on the surface of the big ice sheets, where it slightly darkened the snow and made it absorb more sunlight, helping in small ways to warm and melt it when conditions allowed. More of the dust fell into the seas, where the iron and other minerals it carried fertilized plankton. These tiny organisms drew carbon from the air as they grew, then took it down to the deep sea when they died and sank. It was a planet-scale exchange of materials between land, air, ice, and water. Closer to the ground, the daily experience of climate in an Ice Age region depended entirely on where you stood. Along the equator, if you lived in a rainforest that managed to survive the broader cooling and drying, you might not have felt that you were in any special age at all. Days were still warm and humid. Cicadas shrilled in the heat. Vines dropped from high branches. Yet even there, the cooler global climate shifted the boundaries of forest and savanna. Some tropical forests shrank as moisture became less abundant. In other places, paradoxically, montane cloud forests expanded, fed by different circulation patterns in the atmosphere. In temperate zones, your year would have been quite different from ours. Winter snow lay longer on the ground and extended farther south. Rivers froze more often and stayed locked under ice for much of the season. Lakes grew larger in some interior basins because evaporation was reduced and glacial meltwater filled them. Some of these lakes were enormous by any standard. In North America, for instance, a series of glacial lakes once covered areas equal to or greater than some of our modern Great Lakes. They formed behind natural dams made of ice or moraines, and from time to time those dams failed. When they did, enormous floods roared out, scouring channels and leaving behind landscapes of scabbed rock and scattered boulders. The quiet surface we see today hides a history of violent outbursts. Under the marching ice itself, the story was as much about grinding as freezing. Glaciers may look still in a photograph, but they are rivers of rock-hard water that creep forward under their own weight. At their base, meltwater lubricates the contact with bedrock and allows the mass above to slide and deform. The ice picks up stones, sand, and entire blocks torn from cliffs. These fragments are pressed against the ground, scraped along, and dropped elsewhere. Over tens of thousands of years, this action carves deep, U-shaped valleys where rivers once made sharp, V-shaped cuts. It smooths ridges, leaves behind streamlined hills made of compacted glacial debris, and forms long, sinuous mounds of sand and gravel where meltwater rivers once flowed under the ice. When the sheets finally retreat, they leave behind a litter of features with odd names and a very practical legacy for humans, which is that many of our best soils, lakes, and river systems are built on the wreckage. Take, for example, the broad plains of central North America and parts of northern Europe and Asia that are covered with a fine, uniform sediment called loess. This material is essentially glacial flour, ground from rock by ice and then blown by wind, settling in thick blankets over hundreds of kilometers. It forms soils that can be remarkably fertile when the climate permits agriculture. In China, a vast plateau of such dust built up over repeated cycles, recording in its layers the waxing and waning of Ice Age winds. If you dig down through that dust, you can read the alternation of warm and cold periods, much as you can in the rings of a tree or the layers of Ice Age snow preserved in a polar core. Another place where the Ice Age writes its history is at the edges where sea and land meet. With sea levels lower, continental shelves were dry land, but they were not static. Rivers carved new paths across them, occasionally cutting deep canyons that are now submerged. Coral reefs, trapped by the falling sea, tried to grow upward to keep close to sunlight. In some places they managed, in others they failed, and left behind drowned terraces and ledges. When the seas rose again at the end of the Ice Age, the coastline raced back inland, drowning river mouths and turning them into estuaries and bays. Many of the harbours that humans now use, from the fjords of Scandinavia to the inlets along the Canadian Atlantic coast, were shaped in these glacial times. The rearrangement of land and sea also changed the routes available to animals and plants. Migration paths followed the shifting shorelines and new plains. In Europe and Asia, there were corridors where animals could travel from one end of the continent to the other on relatively flat ground, weaving between ice sheets and mountain chains. In the Americas, there were periods when an interior corridor between western and eastern ice allowed movement south into the interior, and other periods when that way was closed, and only coastal routes remained. Grasses and herbaceous plants spread into the new lands, followed by insects, birds, and mammals. Some groups were trapped when conditions later changed and land bridges vanished beneath the returning waters, which is one reason why island faunas are often so distinctive. If you could have followed a single animal, say a grazing mammal, across this planet under ice, you would have walked a long way. Imagine starting in what is now the south of France, which in a glacial period might have carried a mix of cold steppe and pockets of woodland. You would head north into open grasslands, then find your way around the southern edge of the European ice, perhaps passing through the plains of what is now Germany and Poland. From there you could swing east into the broad reaches of the Russian steppe, then farther on into Siberia, always staying a respectful distance from the frozen caps that sat to the north. Eventually, you would reach the low rolling plain of Beringia, cross it without ever seeing the sea, and enter Alaska and the Yukon, where another open steppe spread before you. The entire journey could be made in a continuous band of chilly but productive habitat, a single giant pasture wrapped around the top of the world. This was the stage on which the mammalian world of the Ice Age developed. The cold and the shifting boundaries forced species to move, to adapt, or to disappear. Some became specialists in the chilly grasslands that stretched around the northern hemisphere. Others learned to live in the shadow of the glaciers, or in the sheltered valleys where remnant forests survived. Predators followed the herds, learning to cover great distances and to work together in the hunt. For the large-bodied mammals, in particular, this was a time of both risk and opportunity. A world where size and stamina could give you an advantage, but only if you could find enough food in a landscape where winter lasted most of the year, and summer was only a brief, fierce, green flare. If you could step quietly out onto the mammoth steppe on a clear morning, the first thing that would strike you would be the sense of scale. The land rolls away in gentle waves of grass and low shrubs. The sky is an enormous pale bowl, and almost everything that moves across this stage is bigger than you expect. Shadows are large, footprints are deep. Even the dung sits in heavy piles, the calling cards of animals that make modern deer look like toys. Out on the horizon, a slow, dark tide begins to form. At first, it is only a shimmer in the air, dust hanging over the grasslands. Then the shapes resolve themselves into backs and shoulders, into a procession of humped silhouettes and curved tusks. A herd of woolly mammoths is on the move. Their fur is long and shaggy, closer to a moving thatch roof than to the neat coat of an elephant. Beneath that insulating blanket lies a thick layer of fat that keeps them warm in winters where the wind can peel the skin off human cheeks. Their tusks sweep forward in graceful arcs, not just decorative sabers, but tools that can scrape snow away from buried grass or push aside small trees. Mammoths were not simply elephants with extra hair. They were fine-tuned machines for dealing with cold and seasonally harsh lands. Their ears were small compared with those of African or Asian elephants, reducing heat loss. Their teeth were built to grind dry, abrasive grasses that had grown under weak sunlight in thin soils. In a molar of a mammoth, you see a complex washboard of enamel ridges perfectly suited to turning brittle stalks into digestible pulp. These animals lived in groups, most likely led by older females, and wandered great distances across the northern plains and valleys, following the green wave of the short summer and the promise of water and shelter. Sharing the world with them, though usually preferring different surroundings, were their more forest-loving cousins, the mastodons. If mammoths were the grazers of open plains, mastodons were the browsers of woodlands and wetlands. Their bodies looked more compact, their tusks straighter, and if you could peer inside their mouths, you would find a very different set of tools. Mastodon teeth had conical cusps suited for chewing leaves, twigs, and soft branches. Where spruce forests and swamps reached their cold-tolerant limits, mastodons threaded between the trunks, breaking branches, pushing through thickets, and leaving behind a trail of trampled saplings and churned mud. In life, they would have given the impression of stocky, shaggy bulldozers, half hidden among the trees. If you walked east from the mastodon swamps into the open reaches of Eurasia, you might see a creature that looked like a prehistoric version of a tank. This was the woolly rhinoceros, an animal built like a massive, horned barrel set on short legs. Its body was covered with long hair, and on its snout grew a pair of impressive horns, the front one sometimes as long as a person is tall. Cave painters in Ice Age Europe drew these animals with sensitivity, suggesting that humans watched them often, probably from a distance. Woolly rhinoceroses grazed on grasses and low plants, using their horns to sweep snow aside and perhaps to spar with rivals. In a blizzard, these heavy shapes would have been barely visible, yet entirely at home, heads down, shoulders hunched against the wind. Not all giants walked on four stout legs. In the Americas, especially in what are now South and Central America, lived the giant ground sloths. Imagine an animal that can stand on its hind legs and look down on an elephant, an animal with claws the length of your hand, more suited to pulling down branches and stripping leaves than to any sort of sprint. Species like Megatherium and Erematherium were among the largest land mammals that have ever lived. Their skeletons show massive hips and powerful tails that might have acted as a third leg when they reared up. When they walked, they placed the sides of their clawed hands on the ground, almost as if they were wearing long, stiff gloves. They were slow, contemplative beings, their lives measured in careful steps rather than in bursts of speed. Sharing those lands, often in the same general ecosystems, were animals that looked as if someone had given an armadillo a suit of medieval armor, and then left it to grow out of control. These were the glyptodonts, relatives of armadillos with broad domed shells made of fused bony plates and tails that in some species ended in heavy clubs covered in spikes. Some were as big as a small car. From above, they must have looked like moving boulders. When threatened, they likely crouched down, presenting a dome of bone to the world, which would have been a frustrating sight for any predator with teeth, but no particular interest in dentistry. In North America, the open plains and parklands supported other large herbivores that looked vaguely familiar, yet were endowed with extra heft. There were steppe bison with horns that curved out and forward, forming a span that could match the width of a tall person's arms. Their shoulders carried tremendous muscle, forming a high hump that made them look as if they were always prepared to push through snowdrifts or rivals. There were camels adapted to cold lands, tall animals that grazed and browsed in what is now the Yukon and the Great Plains, long before their relatives became desert caravans elsewhere in the world. There were horses, wild and stocky, with thick coats and strong hooves that cut into frozen ground. Among these cold-adapted grazers, there moved a stranger with perhaps the oddest face of the Ice Age herbivores, the saiga antelope. Its nose was large, fleshy, and overhanging, like a soft box attached to the front of its face. This curious structure acted as a filter and warmer for the frigid air of the steppes and helped keep dust out of the lungs during the dry season. Viewed up close, a saiga looked faintly comical. Seen moving in a herd across a chilly plain, that crowd of unusual faces became a symbol of fine-tuned adaptation. Each animal a little furnace of warmth, moving through a world that wanted everything to freeze. All of these herbivores, from mammoths to saiga, were not just innocent victims of climate. They were also agents that shaped their own environment. Mammoths pushed over young trees and tore bark, discouraging the growth of dense forests and maintaining open grasslands. Bison and wild horses clipped plants before they could seed, encouraging some species over others. Ground sloths may have been responsible for spreading the seeds of certain trees and shrubs in their dung, a slow, lumbering delivery service that left new patches of vegetation wherever they went. Glyptodonts, with their heavy bodies and habit of digging shallow wallows, probably reshaped patches of soil and drainage. While the glaciers carved the continents in slow motion, these animals were constantly rearranging the living skin of vegetation on top. But a world of large herbivores is also, inevitably, a world of large predators. On another day, at the edge of another herd, you might notice a different kind of movement. Low shapes drifting through the grass, a pause when a head rises, ears pricked, then a slow, coordinated spread as the group fans out. Saber-toothed cats hunted these lands. They were not just cartoon monsters with outsized teeth. Species like Smilodon combined immensely powerful forelimbs with a short, barrel-chested body and neck muscles strong enough to drive their long upper canines into the throat or belly of large prey. They probably preferred ambush over running, using cover where they could, or shadowing herds to pick off the wounded or unwary. In Europe and parts of Asia, the open lands and forests sheltered the cave lions. These big cats, larger than modern African lions, hunted the mammoth steppe and sometimes deined in caves, whose walls also attracted human artists. On stone and bone, we find engravings that many researchers interpret as lions. There are even sculptures of what seems to be a lion-headed human figure, suggesting that these predators had a place in the minds and stories of Ice Age people, as well as in their daily fears. The lions themselves needed skill to survive. Bringing down a healthy bison or horse is dangerous work, and the injuries recorded in their fossil bones show that many paid a high price for their hunting trips. Bears were part of this scene too, and not only the familiar brown and black sorts. In parts of Europe, there lived the cave bear, a huge animal that favored caves as resting places and left behind enormous piles of bones and traces of hibernation nests. Its skull suggests a more plant-based diet than that of a modern grizzly, perhaps feeding heavily on roots and tough vegetation in summer and autumn to build the fat reserves needed for winter sleep. In the Americas, a different bear, often called the short-faced bear, roamed. It was tall, with long legs and a body that, when reassembled in museums, towers over visitors. Debates continue about exactly how predatory this bear was, but it is safe to say that if one wandered into view while you were on foot, you would feel very small and very interested in finding a tree or a sturdy rock shelter. Not all Ice Age giants lived on land. Along cold coasts in the northern hemisphere, marine mammals flourished. Walruses hauled out on the edge of sea ice. dragging their heavy bodies with the help of tusks that they used for display, for fighting, and perhaps for helping to clamber up slippery slopes. Thick layers of blubber insulated them in waters that would strip a human of heat in a matter of minutes. Seals and sea lions bred on beaches and rocky shores, forming rookeries that must have been deafening in the breeding season. A chaos of calls, barks, and splashes set against a backdrop of surf and seabirds. Whales travelled long migration routes from cold feeding grounds rich in plankton to milder breeding waters and back again, following rhythms as old as the Ice Age itself. In the southern lands, there were giants of a different flavour. Australia and its connected neighbours hosted a menagerie of large marsupials. There were heavy browsing creatures like Diprotodon, which at its largest rivaled a rhinoceros in mass and looked, to modern eyes, like a wombat that someone had inflated to improbable size. There were powerful kangaroos that may have walked as much as hopped, moving with deliberate strides across plains and woodlands. There were large predatory marsupials as well, such as Thylacoleo, whose strong jaws and blade-like teeth suggest an animal that could deliver a crushing bite to prey. These creatures evolved in relative isolation, giving the Ice Age of the southern continents a slightly dreamlike cast, as if someone had redrawn the familiar script of big mammals with a different set of actors. New Zealand, which never had its own land mammals of large size before humans arrived, developed giant birds instead. The moas were flightless, long-legged browsers that stretched from species the size of a large turkey up to impressive forms that could look over the heads of most humans. In the forests and shrublands, they fed on leaves, twigs, and fruits. Their main natural enemy was an eagle that could be considered a giant itself, with talons and a beak capable of bringing down these walking towers of feathers. For much of the Ice Age, inland parts of New Zealand would have been stages for silent battles between huge birds, while the rest of the world grappled with mammoths and saber-toothed cats. What all these ecosystems had in common was energy flowing through the bodies of large animals in quantities that are hard for us to imagine today. An adult mammoth eats vast amounts of vegetation every day simply to keep its internal furnace burning. A pack of large cats needs a regular supply of meat. Sloths, though slow, require steady quantities of leaves and shoots. This meant that productive grasslands, shrublands, and woodlands had to exist over broad areas to support them. Where climate and soil allowed for such productivity, the giants moved in. Where cold or dryness limited plant growth, the animals either adapted to lean times, moved elsewhere, or did not appear at all. Within a single herd, life followed a rhythm that echoed the turn of the seasons and the longer swings of climate. Calves and young were born into brief summers when the world was as kind as it ever got, the grass lush and the air warm. Mothers guarded them, older siblings learned the routes that the herd followed, and elders carried in their memories the knowledge of distant waterholes and safe valleys. Predators tested the edges of the herd, looking for weakness. In winters, the same community would tighten, resting leeward of low ridges, breaking snow with their bodies so that the smaller animals could reach the buried plants. Illness and starvation claimed some every year, but for many generations the balance held. These animals were not on the brink every moment, despite the harshness of their world. They were adapted to it, and in their own way they thrived. From a modern point of view, looking back at this parade of large bodies and exotic forms, it is tempting to think of the Ice Age as a grand experiment in making animals as big and impressive as possible. In reality, much of this size came down to simple arithmetic. In cold climates, large bodies lose heat more slowly than small ones because volume grows faster than surface area. A big animal is, in a sense, a slow, leaking thermos flask. It also has more room to store fat for the hungry season. Where plant productivity can support them, big herbivores have advantages. Predators then scale up to match their prey, and the whole system ratchets itself to a higher level of mass. For humans wandering into this world, first as marginal scavengers and hunters in Africa, and later as increasingly successful foragers across Eurasia and the Americas, these giants must have been both a blessing and a nightmare. To see a mammoth herd was to see many years of food and raw material walking past in one noisy procession. To hear a saber-toothed cat roar in the dark, or to glimpse a cave bear at the entrance of a shelter, was to face a danger that no stone wall or wooden fence could easily stop. Over time, people learned to read the movements of herds, to understand the behavior of predators, and to carve their own place into the map of the giants. For now, though, we are simply looking at the animals themselves, at this strange flourishing of large life that turned the cold world of the Ice Age into a living, moving museum of forms. Imagine a small group of people walking along the edge of a frozen river at the end of a long winter day. The sky is pale, the light thin and gentle, and the ice under their feet creaks in a way they have learned not to trust. They move with the easy caution of those who have spent their whole lives in such places, testing the surface with a stick, listening for the hollow sound that means danger. Behind them, the land rises toward a low ridge where their shelter waits, a thin curl of smoke already lifting into the cold air. These are not strangers to this world of cold and wind. This is their home. The Ice Age is not a disaster to them. It is simply what the world is less than one. 4# is greater than. The people you are watching belong to the same species as you. Their bones and teeth would look familiar to a modern doctor. Their hands are the same shape as yours. The difference lies in the training that life has given those hands and minds. From early childhood they have learned to read tracks on hard snow, to feel the quality of wind on the skin and know if a storm is coming, to remember not just one path through the hills but a whole web of routes, each suited to a particular season and purpose. Their world is smaller in distance than the modern globe, but much deeper in detail. Every bend of the river and every line of hills has a name and a story. They do not need maps because the land itself is written into their memory. Is less than one. 4# is greater than. In the far west, in the lands where great herds move across open steppe, some of these people are part of our own lineage, Homo sapiens, whose long story began far to the south. In the colder valleys of Europe and Western Asia, others belong to a different humankind, Neanderthals, whose bodies are thicker and whose faces carry heavy brows over deep-set eyes. Somewhere farther east live yet other relatives, whose traces now survive mostly in the DNA of some modern populations and in a few fragments of bone from caves in high country. These are the Denisovans, shadows on the edge of the human tree. All of them, in their different ways, are children of the Ice Age. They have learned to live with cold and to use the opportunities it offers, is less than 1. 4 is greater than. In the evening, when the small group returns to camp, the settlement reveals itself with a kind of quiet order. This is not a permanent town, but a seasonal resting place that will be used while the nearby hunting and foraging is good. In one region, the shelter might be a ring of mammoth bones, carefully arranged to support a roof of hides and branches. In another, it is a line of tents made from reindeer skins stretched over wooden poles, low and rounded to shed wind. Elsewhere, it is a cave, chosen not just for its dryness, but for the way the morning light enters, or for the shelter it gives to a spring that does not freeze. The details change with region and people, but the principle is the same. These are flexible, portable homes, built to be taken down, moved or rebuilt as the land and the seasons demand, is less than 1. 4 is greater than. Inside, the first thing you would notice is the smell. It is a dense mixture of wood smoke, drying hides, sweat, fat, and cooked meat, a scent that would cling to your clothes for days. The second thing is the constant crackle and glow of fire. Fire is at the center of Ice Age life, in a very literal way. It warms sleeping bodies. It dries clothing that has been soaked by snow and slush. It cooks food that would otherwise be hard to digest or even dangerous. Around it, people mend tools, tell stories, sing, and share news. Fire also has a geography. Good camps are those with ready access to fuel, whether it is driftwood gathered from riverbanks, dead trees from the edges of shrinking forests, or in some lean regions, even dry bone and dung, is less than 1. 4 is greater than. Clothing is another quiet masterpiece of Ice Age ingenuity. At first glance, it seems simple. People wear tunics made from animal skins, trousers or leggings, boots and cloaks or hooded parkas. But every stitch represents knowledge. Sinew from the leg of a reindeer has to be split into fine strands, soaked and softened, then twisted into strong thread. Hides must be scraped, stretched, and treated with fat or brain tissue to keep them supple. Needles fashioned from bone or ivory require delicate shaping and polishing so that the eye does not fray the thread and the point slides smoothly through thick hide. Somewhere around a hearth, a child watches as an older relative shows how to knot the thread, how to keep the seams tight, how to fold fur inside or outside according to use. In this way, the skills that keep death by cold at bay pass from one generation to the next. Hands that can make clothing can also make tools, and Ice Age people are experts at turning stone, bone, and antler into useful shapes. On a flat rock near the edge of camp sits a scatter of flakes from flint or chert, the debris of tool making that an archaeologist will one day examine with great attention. To the person working there now, this is simply the everyday business of making a living. A core of good rock is struck again and again with a hammerstone or an antler billet, sending long, thin flakes flying off. These flakes are then retouched along their edges to produce razor-sharp blades and points. Some will be mounted in wooden shafts with bindings of sinew and glue made from boiled hide. Others will be set in handles to make knives or scrapers. Over time, these tools become more elaborate. In some regions, people develop barbed bone points that can be used for fishing and seal hunting. In others, they invent spear throwers, carved sticks with a hook at the end that allow a human arm to cast a spear, with much greater force and distance than it could manage on its own. Somewhere, perhaps more than once, and in more than one place, the idea of bending a flexible stick and attaching a string to its ends appears, followed by the trick of sending a short arrow along its length. To a mammoth or a reindeer, the end result is the same. Dangerous little points move faster and hit harder than the bare arm alone could manage. Hunting in Ice Age lands is not a matter of wonder and hope. It is the product of careful observation, planning, and cooperation. A single person with a spear is no match for an adult mammoth or a bison. A well-organized group can be. They know where herds like to graze at certain times of year, which valleys they follow in their migrations, where rivers are shallow enough for a crossing, and where a cliff edge might offer a chance to trap and panic animals. On a clear, cold morning, scouts go out to look for fresh tracks and to read the subtle marks left by hooves on frost-hardened ground. In the evening, information is shared by the fire. Plans are adjusted. In many groups, elders who no longer hunt with their bodies still hunt with their knowledge, advising where to go and when. When the hunt comes, it is a mixture of noise and silence. At first, there is the quiet, tense approach, using the land as cover, moving downwind. Then there is a sudden burst of shouting and movement as the hunters close in, spears fly, and animals wheel and break. If a large animal falls, the noise continues in a different key, with the bellowing of the wounded, the crack of breaking bones, and the heavy work of cutting through hide and gristle. Children may be watching from a safe distance, learning where the most valuable parts of the carcass lie, and how to avoid the sweep of a dying hoof. Vultures and other scavengers circle overhead, well aware that a kill means leftovers. For all the drama of big game hunting, much of Ice Age food comes from quieter sources. People gather roots and tubers that can be dug from frozen ground with wooden sticks. They collect berries in the brief summer, sometimes drying them for later. They trap small animals in snares or dig pits and line them with stakes to catch passing deer. Along rivers and coasts, they set nets, weirs, or simple traps made of stakes and woven branches to catch fish as they move upstream. In some cold regions, the sea itself is a more reliable provider than the land. People learn to cut breathing holes in sea ice and wait with patience, ready to send a harpoon down when a seal surfaces to breathe. In a world of such constant practical concerns, it might be tempting to imagine that there is little time or energy for anything we would recognize as symbolic or artistic. Yet the archaeological record of the late Ice Age is filled with objects that suggest a rich inner life. On the walls of deep caves in what is now France and Spain, people painted bison, horses, lions, and other animals with a grace that still takes the breath away. They used charcoal and pigments derived from ground mineral ores, mixed with fat or water, and applied with fingers, brushes made from hair, or even blown through hollow bones. The animals move across the curves of the rock, placed where the shape of the wall lends them life. In some caves, small lamps made of stone held lumps of fat and simple wicks, providing the flickering light in which these scenes were painted and viewed. Outside the caves, people carved and engraved smaller objects. Little figurines of animals and human figures appear, often with exaggerated features that suggest symbolic meaning rather than literal portrait. Some show women with full hips and bellies, sometimes with carefully marked hair or headdresses. On pieces of bone and antler, craftsmen cut lines and patterns that may mark counts of days or seasons, or simply please the eye. Shell beads and pierced animal teeth strung as necklaces and sewn onto clothing glitter around the necks of hunters and gatherers as they move. A person walking across the steppe is not only wrapped in fur and hide, they are also wrapped in stories and symbols that speak of their group, their achievements, and their hopes. If you stayed long enough with one of these communities, you would notice that memory is one of their most precious possessions. Without writing, the past must be carried in minds and voices. People tell children about journeys their grandparents made, about winters of deep snow and summers of great abundance, about the time the river broke its banks and carved a new path through the plain. They remember where obsidian can be found in the hills, where salt licks attract animals, where edible plants grow in spring. They also remember the creatures that share their world. Stories about bears, lions, and mammoths circulate around the fire, some based on experience, others embroidered and reshaped over generations. In this way, knowledge of the land and its dangers becomes a kind of communal library. Social life in these groups is complex in ways that are not always obvious, from scattered bones and stone tools. People form bands of related families that join and separate according to season and opportunity. In times of plenty, several bands might meet at a rich salmon river or a site where herds tend to cross, turning the place into a temporary gathering of dozens or even hundreds of individuals. There they trade objects made from materials rare in some regions. Partners find one another, news travels, and alliances are formed. In lean times, the same bands shrink back to their core members and move apart to reduce pressure on local resources. Among all this movement, the ties of kin and friendship hold things together, supported by rituals, exchanges of gifts, and shared obligations. Language, though invisible in the archaeological record, is perhaps the most powerful tool these people possess. It allows hunters to discuss plans in detail, to imagine alternatives, to tell stories that are not simply about what happened, but about what might happen. It allows them to teach children not only by demonstration, but by explanation. Around the fire, as embers glow and the wind sighs outside, adults can pass on myths of how the world came to be, tales that give meaning to the ice, the stars, and the distant glow of the aurora across the winter sky. For a child drifting to sleep in that glow, the ice sheets and mammoth herds are not anonymous forces. They are characters in a known story. The relationship between these Ice Age people and the land is not only practical, it is also spiritual in a way that we can only partly guess. Careful burials, sometimes accompanied by tools, ornaments, and traces of red ochre sprinkled on the body, suggest that the dead were given more than casual disposal. In some cases, individuals were laid to rest in ways that must have required planning and effort, perhaps reflecting their status or the affection of their community. Skulls of animals appear in special positions in some sites, which may indicate ritual treatment. The painted caves, too, may have been more than art galleries. Entering them, crawling through narrow passages into chambers lit only by small lamps, would have been an intense experience. The images on the walls may have been part of ceremonies that bound people more closely to the animals and to the powers they believed animated the world. Though they live in a cold age, these people are not constantly on the verge of extinction. They are vulnerable, certainly, to injury, illness, and the whims of climate, but they have strategies for coping. They know how to store food by drying meat and fish, or by caching it in cold ground. They know how to share within the group, so that a bad hunt for one family does not automatically mean disaster. Women gather plants and small game that provide a steady foundation for the diet, while men and women both may join in larger hunts depending on the customs of the group. Children help with gathering fuel, carrying water, and watching younger siblings. Elders often act as advisors and keepers of stories. In this quiet but intricate society, the Ice Age is both a constraint and a teacher. It limits where people can live easily and what they can grow or gather, but it also offers clear paths across frozen rivers, rich seasonal concentrations of animals at valley mouths and river crossings, and a kind of stark clarity in the landscape. Snow reveals tracks that would be invisible on bare ground. The low sun angles of high-latitude winters throw long shadows that help mark features in the distance. Frozen rivers become highways for sledges or simple drag frames. The cold that tries to kill you is the same cold that gives shape and structure to your year. From this vantage point, watching a group settle down around a fire as night falls, it becomes easier to see how the Ice Age shaped not only the bodies of animals, but the minds and cultures of people. To live here requires foresight, cooperation, and the ability to imagine futures that are not yet real. Those who cannot imagine how bad a winter might be, who do not plan stores, or who cannot bring themselves to move when the land begins to fail, will suffer. Those who learn to read subtle signs, who can picture where the reindeer herds will be next season, who can think about how the land will look when the ice melts in the spring, will do better. The cold planet is gently, relentlessly selecting for humans who can think ahead. Some of those humans will eventually follow the herds across the land bridge that links continents. Others will remain in the valleys and plains of Europe and Asia, or along coasts rich in fish and shellfish. Others again will linger in Africa, in a different Ice Age world, shaped more by shifting rains than by sheets of ice. Together, they will carry the memory of this cold, bright, wind-filled time into warmer ages. The habits learned here of planning, cooperation, symbolic thought, and careful attention to the land will not vanish when the ice eventually begins to retreat. They are part of what makes our species what it is. One of the most disconcerting things about the Ice Age is that it sounds solid and stable, as if the planet simply turned the temperature down and left it there for a few million years. In reality, the Age of Ice behaved more like a nervous sleeper who cannot decide whether to throw off the blanket or pull it tight. Temperatures lurched up and down, rain belts shifted back and forth. Seas crept out and then rushed back in. If you lived through it, climate was not a polite backdrop, it was a main character. We know this in part because modern humans are very good at drilling holes in things. In Greenland and Antarctica, teams of scientists have patiently bored down through many hundreds of meters of layered ice, bringing up slender cylinders of frozen time. Under the microscopes and in the laboratories, each layer becomes a thin diary entry. Bubbles of ancient air tell us how much carbon dioxide and other gases crowded the atmosphere at different moments. The ratio of heavy to light oxygen atoms in the water reveals how warm or cold the world was when the snow fell. Dust and ash mark, volcanic eruptions, and distant storms. When the record is plotted, it does not look like the gentle curve of a long autumn. It looks like the scribbles of a child with too much sugar inside. In some places, the graphs show that temperatures jumped by several degrees within the span of a human lifetime or two, on a global scale that is astonishingly fast. If you were a teenager on the mammoth steppe when one of these upward jolts began, there is a chance that by the time you were old and telling stories to grandchildren, the land around you would have grown noticeably greener, with shrubs and trees pushing farther north and winters a little shorter and softer. The Ice Age was cold on average, but it delivered that cold in pulses and jolts, not as a smooth and steady drizzle. One of the strangest episodes in this restless pattern arrived near the end of the Great Cold Period. The world was warming. Glaciers were shrinking, seas creeping back toward their modern levels, forests returning to latitudes where frozen ground had once ruled. In Europe, people were starting to see more trees and fewer open plains. Reindeer herds were gradually giving way to red deer and wild cattle. Then, quite suddenly on the geological clock, the warming faltered. For more than 1,000 years, the North swung back toward a bitter chill. This interval is known to scientists as the Younger Dryas, after a hardy little wildflower that likes cold conditions and pops up in pollen records from that time. Imagine standing on a hillside in what is now northern Europe as this reversal took hold. Your parents grew up with summers that seemed steadily milder than those their parents had known. The snow retreated earlier, the rivers thawed sooner, and there was talk that perhaps the land was recovering from some deep injury. But now, year by year, spring comes later. Lakes take longer to lose their ice. Grain, if your group has started experimenting with the idea of cultivation, fails more often. Herds that had been expanding grow leaner. Older people shake their heads by the fire and mutter that the world has turned back to an old mood. What could make the planet do this kind of sharp turn after thousands of years of thawing away from the Great Freeze? If you could stand outside the world and look at the whole climate machine, you would notice that during this time, enormous volumes of meltwater were pouring off the shrinking ice sheets. Where that water went mattered. In North America and Eurasia, huge lakes often formed along the margins of ice, held in place by frozen dams of compacted snow. If one of those dams failed, fresh water would rush into the sea in a geologically sudden pulse. Meltwater that flowed into the North Atlantic could dilute the salty surface waters that usually sink there and drive one of the main conveyor belts of ocean circulation. Interrupt that sinking, and you interrupt the flow of heat that the ocean normally carries toward the north. Many researchers think that something like this happened as the Younger Dryas began. The ocean circulation system faltered. Heat that had been delivered to the far north started to pile up farther south instead. The result was a sharp chill for lands that depend on that oceanic warmth. The idea is still debated in details, and the precise routes of water are reconstructed with a detective-esque attention to faint clues in sediments. But the broad picture is clear enough. The climate system is not a gentle creature. It can switch modes as quickly as a flock of birds, given the right push. While the far north wrestled with its fits of cooling and warming, other regions experienced their own peculiar episodes. The great interior of North America, for example, did not just host moving walls of ice and peaceful grasslands. There were moments when the icy dams, holding back glacial lakes, gave way and sent floods racing across the land on a scale that makes modern rivers look like hobby projects. One of the most dramatic of these episodes took place in the region now known as the Pacific Northwest of the United States. There, a vast lake once filled a basin, now marked by fields and towns. When the ice barrier confining it failed, the water roared out in a series of immense floods. To picture one of these events, imagine a wall of water, several hundred meters high, thick with ice blocks, trees and boulders, moving at highway speed. It rushes across the landscape, stripping soil to bedrock, plucking out chunks of rock the size of houses, and carving deep canyons where before there had been gentle valleys. It leaves behind scoured rock plains, strange isolated hills, and dry channels that now carry only a trickle of water. To the humans and animals in its path, there is little to be done except get to higher ground and hope the place you choose is high enough. Later, long after the lake refills and possibly drains again, the survivors tell stories of a time when the world itself seemed to dissolve and run downhill. Even in regions without such dramatic floods, the Ice Age left curious geological signatures of its more eccentric days. In the dry heart of Central Asia, in parts of the Middle East, and in the Great Basin of North America, there were times when colder climate and altered storm tracks filled basins and lowlands with lakes far larger than the ones we see today. These water bodies formed in regions that are now deserts or sagebrush plains. Perched shorelines, gravel beaches, and old deltas are still visible high above present lake levels, like bathtub rings on the surrounding hills. In some places, the old strand lines sit more than 100 meters above modern water. To people living on the shores of these Ice Age lakes, the world would have felt unexpectedly generous. Fish and birds thrived. Marshes hummed with life. Then, over thousands of years, the waters retreated as the atmosphere rearranged its winds and rains once again. Farther south, in what is now the Sahara, the story is even stranger. When people think of the Sahara, they imagine dunes, endless sand, and an almost complete absence of water. During some intervals of the last glacial period, however, parts of this region looked more like grassland and savanna, dotted with lakes and threaded with rivers. Stone tools and rock art preserve the memory of hippos, crocodiles, and grazing herds in regions that now receive very little rain. The reason lies high above, in the bands of clouds that circle the tropics. As the Ice Age waxed and waned, those belts of rainfall shifted north and south, along with the thermal equator, the moving line where sunlight and heat balance between hemispheres. When the rain belt moved into the Sahara, the desert briefly bloomed. When it shifted away, the sands returned. While all these watery dramas played out, the sky itself sometimes grew darker and more dangerous. Volcanic eruptions punctuated the Neogene and Pleistocene long before humans arrived, but some of the largest occurred during the time of our own genus. One of the most often discussed is the eruption of the Toba volcano in what is now Indonesia, roughly 74,000 years ago. This was not a convenient, manageable event for tourist brochures, but a true super eruption. It blasted so much material into the air that ash fell thousands of kilometers away. Sulfur compounds, lofted into the stratosphere, would have formed reflective droplets, shading the planet and lowering temperatures for years. To a group of humans living at that time, Toba would have been noticed not as a name in a journal, but as seasons that did not behave properly. Skies turned hazy, sunsets became unnaturally vivid. Snow lingered in places where it might normally have melted. Plants took longer to leaf out. Herd animals found less to eat. For people already used to an unforgiving world, it must have felt as if the heavens themselves had joined the ice in a conspiracy. Some scientists have suggested that this event squeezed human populations to very small sizes, though the exact scale of its impact remains under debate. What seems safe to say is that even in an age dominated by ice, fire from inside the Earth could still seize control of the climate for a while. If you step back from the details and try to see the pattern, another oddity of the Ice Age emerges. While the poles and temperate zones shivered and sweated through cycles of glaciers and sudden thaws, the tropics were rearranging their own stories. High rainforest in places like the Amazon basin and Central Africa waxed and waned. When conditions were cooler and somewhat drier, forests shrank into smaller pockets separated by more open woodland and savanna. As climates warmed and moisture returned, trees surged back, reconnecting fragments into continuous forest again. In those moments of fragmentation, species that had once shared a continuous home found themselves in isolated patches. Over thousands of years they diverged, evolving into distinct forms. When the forests later rejoined, the new neighbors had to sort out who lived where. The very diversity of life in tropical forests today owes something to these Ice Age games of hide and seek. The oceans too had their quieter eccentricities. As the great ice sheets grew, sea level fell, exposing broad continental shelves, as we have seen. But the chemistry of the seas also shifted. Cooler water can hold more dissolved carbon dioxide and more oxygen. Circulation patterns changed as salty, dense waters sank in new places, and upwelling currents brought nutrients to the surface in others. In some regions, the combination of wind, dust, and currents created sprawling fields of plankton that must have glowed green from above. These blooms supported shoals of fish and crowds of larger predators, from tuna to great whales. In other periods and places, however, the surface ocean was clearer, poorer in life, and quieter. For the communities that depended on marine food, such as coastal people and seabirds, the Ice Age was a long alternation of feast and lean. From the point of view of a person trying to fall asleep beside a quiet Arctic river or in a sheltered cove, all this might have seemed very far away. Your group cared about the depth of snow this winter, the location of the nearest herd, and whether the ice on the lake would hold for another week. Yet even these immediate concerns were connected to the larger, invisible dances of ocean and atmosphere. A subtle change in the path of a storm track that began over a distant sea could adjust the snowfall here by a finger width or a shoulder height. A change in ocean currents, deep beneath the surface, could tilt the balance between sea ice and open water along your hunting grounds. Now and then the Ice Age climate machine produced local surprises that no one could miss. A winter would arrive that made older people swear they had not seen its like. Ice cracked loudly in trees. Rivers froze so solid that they could bear the weight of mammoth and bison. Snow buried familiar landmarks. Hunters stood on ridges and saw only a blind white world in every direction. The next year might be oddly mild, lulling the unwary into thinking that some general improvement had arrived. Then, after another span of time, perhaps longer or shorter, the pattern would flip again. For people used to reading the land, the lesson was the same. Nothing could be taken for granted for very long. The Ice Age world also contained places that were sheltered from the wildest swings, little pockets of relative stability, where life could keep a lower profile while climate thrashed about outside. Scientists call such spots refugia. These might be south-facing slopes in mountain ranges where sun and terrain kept conditions milder. They might be coastal valleys where ocean air moderated extremes, or deep canyons where wind and cold slid overhead while the floor stayed a little warmer. Forests, plants, and small animals took shelter in these quiet corners. When conditions improved, they spilled back out to recolonize the surrounding land. That is why genetic studies today often reveal that entire regions were repopulated from just a few such safe places. As the cold period wore on, the very variability of climate across the Ice Age may have shaped the minds and cultures of the humans who lived through it. A group that never faced surprise could afford to be somewhat complacent. A group that lived through one jarring reversal after another had to cultivate watchfulness and flexibility. A few hot summers in a row might tempt you to settle on the idea that the climate had changed for good. A sudden return to biting winters would punish that assumption harshly. Over generations, those communities that treated the world as changeable and planned for many kinds of future would have had better chances of leaving descendants than those that believed in a single stable pattern. This habit of expecting the unexpected appears in many traditional stories from cultures that still live close to the land. Tales of floods, of sudden cold, of seas that rose to swallow coasts are common in oral traditions from many parts of the world. Some of these stories may simply be reflections of everyday dangers. Others may be vague but persistent echoes of real events from the last retreat of the ice, passed down and reshaped through countless retellings. A child listening to a myth about a night when winter came too early, or a wave swept inland farther than anyone could remember, is not just being entertained. They are absorbing an attitude toward the world. The lesson is simple. The earth is capable of moods you have not yet seen. Now imagine yourself walking along a coastline during one of the milder intervals near the end of the great cold time. The beach stretches far from the modern line because the sea is still low. Inland, a river meanders across a broad plain that will one day lie under shallow water. People fish in its shallows, children chase birds along the sand, and hunters look for seals or stranded driftwood. It might appear to those people that this coast has been there forever. They do not know that in a few thousand years, or perhaps less, the sea will advance across this entire landscape, swallowing their campsites and leaving only the faintest traces in layers of mud. The Ice Age is full of such quiet foreshadowings. All these odd episodes, from the sudden chills and outbursts of meltwater to the hidden refuges and wandering shores, are like side plots branching off the main story of ice sheets and mammoth herds. Together they make the Age of Ice less like a single long winter and more like a series of turning pages, each with its own surprise. For the mammals and people living through those pages, the only reliable thing about the climate was that it refused to stay the same for long. If you could slow the world down and watch the Great Ice Age from a seat high above the planet, there would be a moment when you would notice something subtle but unmistakable. The bright caps that have sat on the northern continents for ages begin to look a little frayed at the edges. Their surfaces are no longer quite so smooth and dry. Dark streaks appear where rock and soil have melted out. In summer, more water runs off them. What began as a quiet, almost invisible softening becomes a change that even a casual observer would see. The age of expanding ice turns, very gradually, into an age of retreat. For people on the ground, that turning does not arrive with trumpets. It comes in small signs. A hunter in what is now Central Europe notices that the snow in spring lingers for fewer days on the south-facing slope. A family camped in a valley in what will one day be, Canada finds that the river starts to swell a little earlier in the year and carries more water than anyone remembers seeing. Along a long frozen front, the line where ice meets open land begins to wobble and then to pull back. Crevasses open, meltwater streams plunge into blue tunnels, and the whole mass groans as it adjusts to losing its grip on the land underneath. As the ice sheets thin and retreat, they leave behind an extraordinary mess. For hundreds of thousands of years, they have been grinding the surface of continents like enormous traveling millstones. Now, as they shrink, they reveal what they have done. Valleys that once carried small rivers have been deepened and widened into broad troughs. Hills have been rounded and shaved. In some regions, countless blocks of ice lie half buried in sediment. When those blocks finally melt, they leave behind hollows that fill with water, creating chains of small lakes. Where the ice paused for a while before continuing its retreat, it dropped lines of rocky debris that snake across the countryside, like the spoil heaps of a careless builder. In one part of the world we now call Northern Europe, this retreat turns an enormous weight into a rising land. While the ice was at its greatest extent, the crust beneath it sagged like a mattress under a heavy body. When the ice goes, the crust starts slowly springing back. It is a process still going on today. In some coastal regions, the land rises so steadily that old shorelines climb uphill with every century. Rock engravings that were once at the water's edge now look down on fields and forests. To people living there, as the last of the ice melted, the world must have felt far from settled. The ground itself was shifting. Lakes tipped and poured into new outlets. Rivers changed course. What had been a bay became a meadow, and a shallow bog became an arm of the sea. The water that pours off the shrinking ice sheets has to go somewhere. It collects along the margins in a series of enormous lakes, some of which have no equivalent in the modern world. One of them, perched against the retreating ice in what is now North America, would eventually supply water to several of the present Great Lakes and beyond. Another fills the basin that will become the Baltic region. Instead of a brackish arm of the sea, this area is, for a time, a huge lake with fresh water, ringed by young forests and cold winds. The people and animals who live near these waters see them slowly expand, sometimes abruptly decrease when a natural dam gives way, and then fill again in new shapes as the ice backs off and the land beneath rises. Farther out on the continental shelves, where grassland and tundra have stretched for centuries, the sea begins a slow, patient journey inland. To stand on one of these plains at the dawn of the final warming is to witness a world that is already half a memory. The air smells of dry soil and short plants. Rivers meander lazily across broad floodplains before reaching cliffs of ice at the continental edge. Herds of grazing mammals walk the old routes they have always known. Then, gradually, the rivers taste the first hint of salt as the far-off ocean climbs, step by step, up the floodplain. Low-lying channels flood. Bays form where there were none. Tiny, unnoticed by any one person, the shoreline takes a few strides inland each generation. One of the most striking examples of this creeping sea change lies under what is now the North Sea. For a long stretch of late glacial time, that basin is not filled with cold grey water. It is a broad land of rivers, marshes, and gentle hills, connecting what we now call Britain to the rest of Europe. Red deer and wild cattle graze there. People hunt and fish and set up camps on river terraces. They leave behind tools, hearths, and the bones of their meals. To them, this is simply land, just as solid as any other. Only much later, as the ice in Greenland and the last northern remnants of the great sheets melt away and send more water into the oceans, does the sea run in and cover their world. The hills become banks under water. The rivers turn into valleys on the seafloor. Those camps and campsites will sit buried in sands and mud for 10,000 years and more. At the other side of the world, something similar happens on the bridge between continents in the far north. The long, windy plain that has linked Asia to America for generations, the path along which animals and people have moved at walking pace, starts to become narrower. Marshes expand where permafrost begins to soften. Shallow inlets form along the edges. For a time the crossing is still possible, but harder. Eventually, even those hardy enough to live there will find that the bridge has broken into islands, then into shoals, and finally into open water. Two great land masses that had been quietly joined for ages become islands in their own right. The rising seas do not come alone. As the ice retreats, green follows. In lands that lay near the former ice fronts, the first colonists are often hardy plants that can tolerate cold and thin soils. Grasses, sedges, and tiny flowering pioneers arrive with the wind and in the fur of animals. Mosses creep in where moisture lingers. Lichens paint the rocks. In a short time, what was bare mud and rock begins to carry a skin of life. Once these early plants take hold, they trap dust and organic matter, deepening the soil. Shrubs then advance, followed by trees where climate allows. In Europe, birch and pine move northward first, their seeds carried on the wind. Later, heavier forest species like oak, beech, and elm spread in waves, flowing around lakes and up valleys, turning open periglacial plains into deep woods. Animals follow the plants. Reindeer and wild horse give way in some countries to red deer and wild boar. The steppe that had once stretched unbroken across the northern hemisphere shrinks into patches and then into memory. The giant wool-clad grazers find that their preferred food and terrain are retreating with the cold. Mammoth grass does not flourish under closed forest. A creature built to roam open, windy lands does not thrive in dense woods. While some local groups of these animals shift to new regions farther north or east, others find themselves stranded between forest and sea. The changing world reshapes the lives of humans as well. In the temperate regions of the Old World, the spread of forest changes the available animals and plants. Hunting a red deer in woodland is a different business from hunting an antlered giant on open plain. It requires different tactics and often smaller groups. The same trees that make hunting more complex offer new resources. People learn more ways to use wood, bark, and nuts. Rivers are crowded with fish in some seasons. As climates soften and growing seasons lengthen, experiments that might have been impossible under the older, harsher regime begin to make sense. Somewhere in the broad zone from the eastern Mediterranean to the grasslands between rivers, a few groups begin to stay longer in one place, to tend patches of wild grain, to save seed. In regions closer to the former ice, people adjust in other ways. Some continue to follow herds of cold-adapted animals as they move north, keeping close to river valleys where grassland survives between spreading patches of forest. Others turn to the sea, exploiting the rich concentrations of fish, shellfish, and marine mammals in coastal waters. The edge between land and water becomes a new frontier of opportunity as rising seas flood estuaries and create sheltered bays. Shallow banks warm quickly in the sun, attracting life. People who learn to build simple boats, to set nets, or to collect shellfish at low tide find that the shore can feed them more reliably than the uncertain herds of the interior. Amid all this adjustment, another story is unfolding, one that gives the end of the Ice Age a melancholy cast. As the climate warms and landscapes rearrange themselves, many of the large animals that have come to define the age start to disappear. Some fade quietly, leaving only bones and a few last tracks. Others vanish in what looks, from our perspective, like a sudden collapse. The pattern is not uniform. In different continents, the roll call of losses is different and the timing varies. Yet, there is a broad shared theme. Large mammals, especially those that reproduce slowly and require large territories, prove vulnerable at this turning point. One of the saddest and most debated examples comes from the Americas. These continents host an astonishing array of large creatures during the late Ice Age. There are mammoths and mastodons, ground sloths and glyptodonts, robust horses and camels, enormous bison, and powerful bears. Within a relatively short span of time around the transition from the glacial world to the new, warmer climate, many of these forms vanish. The bones show that some survived well into the period when forests were spreading and humans were making more and more use of these lands. Then they stop. Deposits that were rich in remains from big animals become quiet. Why this happens has kept scholars arguing politely, and sometimes not so politely, for decades. One family of ideas points to the climate itself. The final warming is not just a matter of ice melting at the poles. Temperature, rainfall, and vegetation patterns are all changing on a scale that would be daunting for any creature specialized for the old conditions. A mammoth that needs vast areas of dry grassland to feed may simply run out of suitable range as that grassland shrinks and breaks into fragments. Ground sloths adapted to particular combinations of plants and weather may find that those communities dissolve. If this were the whole story, we might expect a slow, drawn-out dwindling, different in timing in each region, according to local climate history. Yet there is another new factor in the mix. By the time the last ice sheets are retreating, human beings are no longer rare visitors in these landscapes. In the Americas, they may be relatively recent arrivals, but they are energetic and inventive. They carry spear points that are works of art in stone, thin and symmetrical, designed to be effective against large animals. In Eurasia and other parts of the Old World, humans have been present for longer, but they too are now armed with increasingly sophisticated tools and with cooperative hunting strategies that have served them well through many glacial cycles. It would be surprising if their activity had no effect at all on the animals they pursue. Some researchers have proposed that humans acted as the final straw for species already stressed by climate. According to this view, big animals might have managed to adapt to the warmer, more variable conditions if left alone. They had already survived earlier warmings. But now, just as they are struggling to find new ranges, they must also contend with a predator that can plan, coordinate, and wield weapons. Even a modest increase in mortality can tip a slow-breeding population into decline. If every year a slightly higher number of young mammoths or sloths fails to reach adulthood because of human hunting, an apparently stable herd can shrink over a few centuries into extinction. Others have suggested that the human contribution may have been more abrupt, at least in some regions. In this picture, bands of hunters moving into a continent rich in naive animals. Creatures that have never met a predator, who throws projectiles or lays elaborate traps, can cause a cascade of collapses. When a group of people finds that a single successful hunt can supply their needs for weeks, they may not see a problem in repeating that success over and over. The landscape itself appears inexhaustible. Only when the herds thin and the big shapes are no longer seen on the horizon does the scale of the change become obvious. In reality, the story might be different in every region. In Australia, for example, many large marsupials disappear long before the last of the northern ice retreats, in a period when climate shifts and human arrival appear to coincide. In Europe, some Ice Age giants linger as the forests spread, only meeting their end thousands of years after the first signs of warming. On islands, the timing is even more varied. In some cases, large animals survive in small populations long after their relatives on the mainland have gone. One of the most poignant cases lies on a remote island in the Arctic, north of the mainland of Siberia. There, a population of mammoths manages to hold on for many thousands of years after the last individuals on the continents have disappeared. Isolated by rising seas, cut off from new arrivals, they shrink in body size through the familiar process of island dwarfing. You would not know from the shape of their bones that they had once belonged to a world where massive herds roamed endless steppes. They are, in a sense, the last echo of that world, living on a fragment of land that itself is at the mercy of the warming climate and changing oceans. Eventually, they too vanish, leaving the planet without any living example of their kind. On another fragment of land far to the south and west, a different set of giants meets its end, not during the heart of the Ice Age, but somewhat later, as human settlement spreads. On the islands that will become New Zealand, the great birds known as moas, and the huge eagles that preyed upon them, disappear within a short period after the arrival of people with fire and sharp tools. In Madagascar, massive birds and lemurs vanish in a similar way. These events remind us that the pattern of late survival and sudden loss is not confined to the classic Ice Age mammals, but is part of a broader reshaping of the large animal world in the wake of both climate change and human expansion. As the centuries pass and the old megafaunal cast fades from the stage, other animals move into the space they leave. In Europe, wild cattle, deer, and boar become more numerous in the deepening forests. Wolves, lynx, and brown bears adjust to the new menu. In the Americas, the bison that survive will eventually become the signature grazers of the grasslands, adapting to a world without mammoths. In Africa, where humans and large animals have coexisted for a long time, and where the climatic changes at the end of the Ice Age are somewhat less severe than in the north, a greater number of large mammals managed to carry on. Elephants, rhinos, hippos, and many species of antelope continue to walk the African savannas, perhaps because they have had more time to learn how to deal with human hunters, and because their environments do not change quite as abruptly. For human societies, the loss of the giants is both a blow and an invitation. It removes from their world some of the most dramatic sources of meat and materials they have ever known. An entire style of life built around following herds of big grazing animals becomes less secure. At the same time, the new climate, with its more predictable seasons, especially in some latitudes, supports denser plant growth and makes the tending of crops more attractive. Settlements grow more permanent where soils and rainfall are kind. Domesticated animals, smaller than the Ice Age giants but easier to manage and breed, begin to appear in wider and wider regions. There is a strange, almost eerie sense in which the end of the Ice Age is also the beginning of the world we find familiar. As the last great sheets of ice pull back into high mountain valleys and polar basins, the outlines of modern coastlines settle into place. Forests in temperate zones reach something like their present extent, at least until farmers arrive with axes. The mode of climate the Earth slips into, with relatively modest swings in temperature compared with the restless glacial centuries, sets the stage for agriculture, towns, and eventually cities. The mammoth steppe, the wool-clad rhinoceros, and the saber-toothed cat move from being neighbors and dangers to being memories and stories. If you could walk through one of the new forests on a quiet evening a few thousand years after the last continental ice has vanished, you might find it surprisingly peaceful. Birds call from branches, boar root and snuffle in the undergrowth. Deer move softly between tree trunks. Somewhere on the edge of a clearing, a small group of humans tends a fire. They are telling stories about the creatures that used to roam the open lands before the trees came, about monsters with curving tusks and claws like knives. Children listen with wide eyes, trying to imagine such beasts, while outside the circle of light the woods breathe in their slow green rhythm. If you stand on a hill in almost any landscape today and let your eyes wander, you are looking at the afterglow of the Ice Age. The glaciers have gone from most of the places they once ruled, but their fingerprints are everywhere. A valley that is broad and flat-bottomed, instead of narrow and V-shaped. A hill that looks as if it has been sliced on one side and smoothed on the other. a chain of lakes stepping away into the distance. All are quiet reminders that ice was once here, heavy and patient, shaving and dragging the ground into new forms. In some parts of the world, the land has not yet finished adjusting to that weight. Northern Scandinavia and large areas around Hudson Bay are still very slowly rising, like a mattress that was compressed for a very long time and is now recovering. Tide gauges along certain coasts show the sea apparently falling, not because the water is disappearing, but because the land is lifting itself up. People build harbors and find that a few centuries later, they sit awkwardly above the modern shoreline. Ancient shorelines climb hillsides as stone terraces and old beach gravels, marking past positions of the sea like chalk lines on a door frame that once measured the height of a growing child. The Great Lakes that dot many maps are also part of this inheritance. In North America, the familiar chain of inland seas owes its size and shape to basins that were deepened and widened by repeated visits from moving ice. When you watch a ship slide out of a harbor, on Lake Superior or Erie, you are seeing it float in a bowl that was carved and scoured by glaciers, then filled when the last of that ice melted. The same is true of many long, narrow lakes in Europe, of the fjords that cut into Norway and New Zealand, and of the drowned valleys that form sheltered harbors from Chile to Scotland. Holiday cottages, fishing boats, busy ports, and quiet reed beds all occupy spaces prepared by the Ice Age masons. The food on many tables carries a similar signature. The broad plains of central North America, the North European lowlands, parts of northern China, and the valleys of several great rivers are covered with deep, fine-grained soils that owe their origin to material ground from rock by ice and then spread by meltwater and wind. Farmers plough fields that sit on ancient rock flour, mixed and remixed by river floods and settled out of dusty Ice Age air. Wheat, maize, barley, and rice grow where glaciers once crushed mountains. When a combine harvester rolls along the horizon, it is in some sense finishing a job that began when a glacier began to chew at the bedrock of a distant range. The cast of animals that share our present world also keeps a kind of faded family resemblance to that colder time. In the far north, musk oxen still huddle on windswept tundra, wearing coats that would not have looked out of place beside mammoth herds. Reindeer still walk the long routes between winter forest and summer plains, their migrations tracing ancient paths that were already old when the last ice sheets melted. Arctic foxes, snowy owls, lemmings, and many hardy plants are not new inventions. They are survivors of a climatic experiment, still carrying in their bodies the solutions that allowed them to endure snow-packed winters and brief, frantic summers. Humans have turned some of these survivors into partners. The herders who guide reindeer across the tundra, the sled drivers who stand behind teams of huskies, and the fishers who travel frozen rivers on snow machines are working with animals whose ancestors learned their trade on the mammoth steppe. Somewhere in the late Ice Age, wolves and people began to share campsites, meat, and perhaps watchfulness in the dark. From that uneasy alliance came dogs, animals whose ability to read human gestures and moods may have helped hunters and travelers in those long winters, and still helps us today when we walk them through city streets or call them in from modern gardens. Even the climate, that feels normal to us, the relatively gentle pattern of seasons and storms that allowed agriculture and cities to develop, is part of this legacy. The long sawtooth pattern of cooling and sudden warming that defined the Ice Age has, for the span of human history, been replaced by a more modest wobble. Sea levels stopped racing inland and settled into something like their present range. Temperatures steadied just enough to let farmers plan for next year with some confidence that the ground would not be locked under permanent snow. It is within this brief calm, this interlude in a much longer tale, that we invented writing, law, and traffic jams. On a quiet night, if you lie in bed and think about your own home, you can read some of this story in the shapes around you. Perhaps your city sits on a river terrace that once looked out over glacial floodwater, or your town nestles in a valley that was deepened by ice. Perhaps the fields outside your window are green thanks to sediment that was laid down in a cold lake a very long time ago. The Ice Age is not just something that happened far away to mammoths and cave people. It is literally under your feet.